it sort of did predict the way comics were going. I don't know if Miller meant anything by it at the time, the state of the industry or not. And of course, the other is Moore's magnum opus, Watchmen, which I've shown you before, but I always like being able to show you something when I talk about it. And again, an even more complicated and even more direct deconstruction of the superhero genre, and breaking down all sorts of conventions and things like that. And again, I could do a series of episodes simply just talking about Watchmen. It is so complex and layered and interesting, just very interesting. Even if you think it's overrated or you don't like it that much, you can't deny that it's very interesting work. Especially remember 1986 when it was written. So comics were going somewhere, and it's funny. Sometimes if you look up comics and about the ages, some people will say sort of the Bronze Age ended somewhere around then, 86 into the late 80s, and then now we're in the modern age, which is just sort of gone from 86 to now, which I don't buy. And just calling something the modern, what does that mean? Are we ever going to get out of the modern age? Is there just those ages, gold, silver, bronze, modern till the end of time? No, I don't think so. I don't think it's going to work that way. So now we're already past the length of even a normal episode. I'm finally going to get to the subject of my series, which is the Dark Age of comics. That's not a term that's universally accepted. It's not universally even known, but I certainly subscribe to it. I certainly buy into it, and I use it. And again, I have my own ideas about when it started. Did it start right in 1986? Well, to me, not really. To me, the late 80s was sort of laying a groundwork. I would say that perhaps the Dark Age started sometime in late 91, early 92. To me, the really big event that marked the beginning of the Dark Age was probably the founding of Image Comics, which was in 1992, which came from a mass exodus, mostly from Marvel, of very, very talented, very getting to be famous. That was also a new trend coming in out of the late 80s, was that suddenly artists were getting top billing over writers. And so amongst them, of course, Todd McFarlane rises to the top. And of course, there was other big names. Robert Kirkman. Let me consult here. It's funny that I can't think. Oh, of course, Rob Liefeld, who we're going to be talking about. Jim Lee. And there were others. Silvestri. I can't think of his first name. Mark Silvestri. But anyway, and they founded Image Comics, which was all about creator-owned stuff. The idea, being that if you created a character or a series, you had creative control over it. There was a lot of clashes with upper managements, particularly in Marvel at the time, about that. That they were upset that they didn't have the creative control they wanted. I don't think maybe they were getting the royalties they thought they deserved. Again, it was a new trend coming out of the 80s that suddenly comics would, just because of an artist's name, would just shoot right up in sales, and records are suddenly being broken. So Todd McFarlane, in particular, he was a very big talent, and had obviously a lot of ambition and things. And one of the things that did come out of his work, he worked on various Marvel titles, was very popular, gained a lot of fame very quickly, and Marvel very shrewdly gave him his creative control of his own Spider-Man series, simply to be titled Spider-Man. This is around 1990. This is the very first arc of it, called Torment, which, believe it or not, this is five comics. And all it is, and these are more or less stories that don't have much to do with continuity that much. And all it is Spider-Man winds up being drawn out because the Lizard is in town. And the Lizard, who's always a dangerous bad guy before, suddenly seems to be crazy and killing people, which he'd never done before, and just being vicious. And I will say right now, I'm not a Todd McFarlane fan, and a lot of the stuff I'm going to say about the Dark Age is going to be more or less critical. And again, you can't just pin it all on one guy. But I will say he draws my favorite Spider-Man. I think one thing he brought was he brought back something that had been ignored in the last few decades. Was that Spider-Man was very agile, and he really wanted to focus on the spider aspect. And so he has all sorts of great shots of Spider-Man contorting his body and perching and swinging and looking, very different. Not like a normal human, which I thought was cool. If you see throughout here, the panel layout is very specific. The way he likes having really small panels inside larger ones. You also notice he doesn't use the whole page often. He likes having a black border as the background for everything to work with him. And it all looks very good. It looks fantastic. But this is a very simple story that is basically drags on. And you might notice that there's all sorts of captions here, because the whole thing was that McFarlane wasn't content just being an artist. He wanted, to write. So this is a full thing. He's writing and drawing these, scripting in. drawing them. And McFarlane might have gotten better as a writer, but he never became that good, if you ask me. And these are just really annoying. You read all these captions, it's just this annoying narrative that goes on and on. Why this took 5 whole comics to accomplish is beyond me, because, he's just being overindulgent. It turns out that Calypso, who is Kraven the Hunter's lover, is trying to take revenge on Spider-Man for Kraven's death. Kraven had killed himself because of Spider-Man. And using her crazy voodoo magic, had sort of possessed the lizard to do all this. And of course, Spider-Man gets very beaten up. But anyway, blah, blah, blah. Talking way too much about that. And here's a few of the individual issues of the next arc that I have. And you'll notice right up here that winning some awards for sales. And I own these because they are quite beautiful, and I really do enjoy McFarlane's Spider-Man. So where am I? So we're probably somewhere in the early 90s, I suppose, when I really think that the Dark Age starts to kick into gear. Now, what is the Dark Age? You might want to know. And another huge digression here. Way back when I did an introduction, when I started doing this over a year ago, I said something that was probably funny to a lot of you. I said when I was a kid, when I was first trying to get into comics, I was almost a little intimidated by the comic scene, which you might say, what? Where I thought, I wasn't cool enough, or I thought, if I went into a comic book store, I wouldn't really know what I was doing, I'd stick out. And I know what you're thinking. What? Well, this is partially because of the Dark Age. Because the Dark Age really was supposed to make comics more hip and more adult. And of course, what happened was some things, I won't say all, but some of the trends became so over the top that instead of being adult, they almost became maybe positively adolescent. Alan Moore, to this day, is a big critic of that age, and he's sort of he'll even admit perhaps that he's somewhat embarrassed for the role he played in it. He didn't really mean to get things going, but he does understand that some of his contributions led to what happened. Again, you can say, whoa, isn't he a massive ego to take credit, even if it is blame? And yeah, well, that's Alan Moore. But he does have a point. So this, there's a quote from the Marvel year in review from 1993. 1993, I believe, is the absolute height of the Dark Age, and really when I was starting to look at comics. And it was 1993 was the year that Superman died and Venom got his own comic book series. So just keep that in mind. And yes, do keep that in mind. So that was the other thing, how far can we push this dark, edgy thing? Well, nothing can get bigger than killing off Superman, arguably the most popular and dominant superhero comic icon of all time. Now, of course, it was a comic book death, and he did come back. But it was still all about, punching the audience in the face and showing us something really extreme, and of course, the pretenders that wound up in his place, they all had their own sort of dark edginess to them. You could probably play a drinking game for every time I say dark or edgy or something, but really that's where it was going. And then, especially between Marvel and DC, we sort of saw this competition of trying to one-up each other for coveted sales. They've lost a lot of people who are now in Image. The flagship title, of course, being Spawn, which sold millions and millions of copies. It was a very anticipated release, to say the least, in the comic book community, and it was another thing that was probably one of the first things to really cross over. I think it's fair to say, for good or for ill, that Spawn was the first comic book a lot of non-comic book readers picked up, because it had something that interested them. And again, was I intimidated by all this? Well, yes, because there was a show that came on YTV, and I was a kid of the 90s and a Canadian kid, so YTV was my go-to channel. It's sort of like our equivalent to Nickelodeon, I suppose. It's all about, kid stuff and wacky stuff, and everybody knows there was probably nothing wackier than early 90s, so, really, I was really there for, the forefront of that. And there was a really good show that came on late, and this is almost the start of my love affair with late hours, and it was called The Anti-Gravity Room, which did air in the U.S. also. It aired on the Sci-Fi Channel. But it was a Canadian show, and one of the hosts, who was based in Toronto, was Phil Guerrero, who is a TV personality in Canada. He was the host of YTV's The Zone, which was sort of like an after-school thing, where they'd show various cartoons and stuff. I remember Power Rangers was one of them, and things like that, and they always had, wacky sidekicks, Muppet things. Actually, Phil's biggest sidekick, you can look it up, was a thing called Snit, which was basically just a TV screen that had, its own weird purple outline, and it had, a close-up shot of huge teeth that it talked through, and it was called Snit, and that was what he had to banter with back and forth. Ridiculous, I know, but it was kind of cool back in the day. Anyway, so Phil, here's sort of like here's his nighttime job. He's on this cool show that was all about comics. It was all about comic books. It was all about the industry, and it was taking place right during the height of the Dark Age. So every night I was seeing like all this stuff. I was getting bombarded by stuff about Image Comics, stuff about like recent happenings like the death of Spider-Man, stuff like Nightfall, which fascinated the hell out of me.